At the beginning of this review, I called this a coming-of-age story, or a Bildungsroman, not a romance. And I stand by that. Hey everybody, welcome back to It's Too Late to Apologize Book Reviews. I'm Stella, and today we're going to be talking about Jane Eyre, written by Charlotte Bronte. Jane Eyre was published in 1847 and written by Charlotte Bronte and published under the pen name Currer Bell. It's a Bildungsroman, or a coming-of-age story that follows a little orphan girl into adulthood. It is an intimate first-person narrative that focuses on moral, personal, and spiritual development. This book is broken into 3 parts. The first being about Jane's childhood, where she is abused emotionally and physically by her aunt and cousins. It feels very Oliver Twist, but there is this interesting moment toward the end of this section where an apothecary who is treating Jane asks her if she is so unhappy with her aunt, if she would prefer to live with a poor family who could love her. And she says no. And this is incredibly telling to me. One may say that this shows Jane's snobbery towards class, but I think it actually shows her wisdom at such a young age. She chooses instead to be sent away to school. And it answers the thought or question that to Jane, there are things more important to her than love, that there are things worth suffering for. And Jane has been so deprived of love her entire life. It is something she wants desperately, but she is not about to sacrifice everything for it. You see where this is going, right? Part 2 takes place in Lowood Institution, which is a school for orphan and poor children where she suffers the stern maltreatment of Mr. Brocklehurst. She is humiliated, but through Helen and Miss Temple, she finds kinship and female role models who suffer also, but are trying to make the best of their situation. A typhus epidemic hits the school, and the malnourished, poorly dressed for winter students are decimated, and many of the children die, including Helen, which brings mass reforms to the school. An interesting fact is that Charlotte's 2 older sisters died of tuberculosis, and Charlotte maintained that her own health and physical development, along with the death of her sisters, were due to the poor living conditions at the school they attended, and Lowood Institution is based on her experiences there. Jane proves herself and rises in status among the students by working hard at school, and years later becomes a teacher there. But when Miss Temple marries and leaves the school, Jane feels lost, as the person who made the school feel like home was gone. She seeks out a governess position and leaves the school to venture off into the world on her own for the first time in her life. Part 3 takes place after Jane leaves Lowood and is now a young adult. She goes to be a governess at Thornfield Hall. She meets her student, Adele Varnes, and begins to love the little orphan girl as she sees echoes of her own childhood in her. Jane meets her employer, Edward Fairfax Rochester. Rochester's first impression is not good. He's stuck up, ornery, and flippant. But slowly Jane begins to develop feelings for Rochester, as she sees past his hard exterior he shows to the world. And he seems to be spending much more time at home than he's used to. They challenge each other's opinions and gain each other's respect, and come to really understand each other's odd personalities that are outside the norm of society. Now, if you don't want any spoilers for Jane Eyre, you should check out now, because we're about to get into it. Rochester seems to be courting Blanche Ingram, and Jane can't figure out why, because the woman has the personality of a wet tea bag. She's a gold-digging snob with an attitude problem. One evening, a gypsy woman comes to Thornfield Hall to tell everyone's fortunes. The gypsy woman ends up being Rochester in disguise, and he's trying to find out how Jane feels about him, because she plays her hand pretty close to the chest, if you know what I mean. This seems like a ridiculous move on Rochester's part, but it was an interesting device that Bronte uses to show the big differences between Jane and the others at this party. Jane isn't scared to see the fortune teller. She keeps her wits about her and doesn't let herself be manipulated. And she also doesn't fall into the vanity of seeking one's fortune and trying to be led by her. Rochester eventually confesses that he's in love with Jane and wants to marry her. Jane can't understand why, but she agrees. On the wedding day, it's revealed that Rochester is married and has been hiding his mentally ill wife in the attic. Jane's devastated. But Rochester tells her that they can move to France where no one will know them, and there they can live together as man and wife. Jane cannot allow herself, or Rochester, to live in sin, so she leaves Thornfield Hall in secret, alone, and with little money. She ends up at Moor House, cold and starving. She meets Diana and Mary Rivers, as well as their brother, St. John Rivers. Jane proves her merit and becomes a teacher of a local school, and discovers that a relative has left her a huge sum of money that she splits with Diana, Mary, and John after discovering that they are relations of hers. John asks Jane to marry him and go with him on missionary work to India. She refuses because he doesn't love her, but she leaves to find out what happened to Rochester. Turns out his wife burnt down the house and died in the fire, and he was badly injured in the event and lost a hand and his sight. Jane and Rochester still love one another and marry. She has a child with him, and eventually he regains a bit of his sight. There is so much that happened in this 500-page novel, it was tough to summarize. I want to go back to part 2 of this story, when Jane first arrives at Lowood Institution and meets and befriends Helen. Helen is reading a book called Rasselas, a novel written by Samuel Johnson. I haven't read this novel, so I went straight to Wikipedia. And Rasselas is a reflection of lost youth in the character of Rasselas, who is exiled from Happy Valley. Rasselas has also been viewed as a reflection of Johnson's melancholia, projected onto the wider world. And some have interpreted the work as an expression of Johnson's Christian beliefs, arguing that the work expresses the impossibility of finding happiness in life on earth, and ask the reader to look to God for ultimate satisfaction. End quote. And this is definitely the position that Helen takes. Rasselas concerns itself with a young man traveling in the company of an honored teacher, encountering and examining human suffering in an attempt to determine the root of happiness. But complete happiness is elusive, and even searching for it displays the vanity of man. And this is the core theme of this novel. Jane's search for happiness in a life of suffering. Helen believes only in God can one find this happiness, but Jane isn't convinced. So in this passage, Jane and Helen are talking about what makes a person good and what makes a person bad. And Helen always sees her own flaws, and Jane refuses to acknowledge them. Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them that hate you and despitefully use you. Then I should love Miss Reed, which I cannot do. I should bless her son John, which is impossible. In her turn, Helen Burns asked me to explain, and I proceeded forthwith to pour out, in my own way, the tale of my sufferings and resentments. Bitter, truculent, when excited. I spoke as I felt, without reserve or softening. Helen heard me patiently to the end. I expected she would then make a remark, but she said nothing. Well, I asked impatiently, is not Miss Reed a hard-hearted, bad woman? She has been unkind to you, no doubt, because, you see, she dislikes your cast of character, as Miss Scatcherd does mine. But how minutely you remember all she has done and said to you. What a singularly deep impression her injustice seems to have made on your heart. No ill usage so brands its record on my feelings. Would you not be happier if you tried to forget her severity together with the passionate emotions it excited? Life appears to me too short to be spent in nursing animosity or registering wrongs. We are, and must be, one and all, burdened with faults in this world. But the time will soon come, I trust, we shall put them off, in putting off our corruptible bodies, when debasement and sin will fall from us, with its cumbersome frame of flesh. And only the spark of the Spirit will remain, the impalpable principle of life and thought, pure as when it left the Creator to inspire the creature. Whence it came will return, perhaps again to be communicated to some being higher than man, perhaps to pass through gradations of glory, from the pale human soul to brighten the seraph. Surely it will never, on the contrary, be suffered to degenerate from man to fiend. No, I cannot believe that. I hold another creed, which no one ever taught me, and which I seldom mention, but in which I delight, and to which I cling, for it extends hope to all. It makes eternity a rest, a mighty home, not a terror and abyss. Besides, with this creed, I can so clearly distinguish between the criminal and its crime. I can so sincerely forgive the first, while I abhor the last. With this creed, revenge never worries my heart. Degradation never too deeply disgusts me. Injustice never crushes me too low. I live in calm, looking to the end. A big theme in this part of the novel is how one should deal with the people who cause you suffering. Jane thinks one should strike back, but Helen believes we would all be better off if we did not allow ourselves to keep a running tally of all the wrongs done to us, for we are all burdened with faults. That's a big ask, Helen, but it sure is a wise one. At the beginning of this review, I called this a coming-of-age story, or a Bildungsroman, not a romance. And I stand by that, because it's not a romance. If you remove Rochester from the story, it still stands on its own, because the romance wasn't the central piece. The romance wasn't the point. Rochester was just another event in Jane's life that challenged her principles. This story was about Jane trying to find her place in the world, her purpose and meaning without sacrificing her principles. It was a story about her moral, personal, and spiritual development. Love came close to making her abandon her ethics, but she wouldn't allow herself to do it. She would rather starve, beg, and earn her own way than compromise what she thought right and noble. Rochester and Jane are not considered beautiful. Several times they are called out for being ugly or plain. But it is not the beautiful things in one's life that brings happiness, but feeling significant by being important to others. There is happiness in being able to care for someone you love, of needing each other, but not in a codependent way. The humble but beautiful mundane. I loved how intelligent Jane was, but she never shoved it in anyone's face. Rochester recognizes that she was his intellectual equal, even though she was quite a bit younger and far less worldly than him. And it is so often downplayed, but it was critical to her happiness to be seen as an intellectual contender. There is this complexity of the feminine that is being addressed here, in that she is a caregiver, a mothering, nurturing woman, but that she needs to have an intellectual outlet or goal as well. I often feel this is a topic so rarely handled well in art and society, as it often lacks maturity and personal accountability. Modern extreme militant feminists want to divorce these aspects from one another and focus only on the career or intellectual pursuits possible for women. And the extreme conservatives want women to only embrace their mothering nature, as if that alone should sustain them. But here is this yin and yang that women battle with, and it was so well addressed in this novel. It was so far ahead of its time. Or perhaps it is a struggle that will never leave us, because it has been with us since time immemorable. Jane is willing to give herself to a life of service, to something greater than herself, even though there is no love between her and St. John Rivers. She could make her peace with that. She could live without love, so long as she had purpose, but she could not live without her freedom. And that is why she couldn't marry him, because service without freedom is slavery. This novel really brought to the surface a topic I've long thought about, which is the thing many people criticize Rochester for. Everyone has so much compassion for mental illness today, which is amazing and needed. There is also so much more awareness around abusive relationships, which is also a huge step in the right direction. Marriage is for better or worse, in sickness and in health, which is a beautiful promise. But what happens when the abuse is perpetrated by someone with mental health issues? While everyone agrees that abuse is wrong, people with mental illness abuse their partners, and often the partner is expected to be patient and supportive, or else it's perceived as abandonment and selfishness. This is a very delicate topic. I have some close friends who have gone through this. My one friend's spouse went through some very serious mental health issues, and their relationship became emotionally and financially abusive for almost 10 years. The loneliness, isolation, and despair my friends went through makes me very sympathetic to both Bertha and Rochester. And I know we're only getting Rochester's side of the story, but Bertha's brother didn't negate anything Rochester said about his sister. I've heard people say they think Rochester is abusive for locking up his wife and trying to marry Jane without her knowing. But I sympathize with his lonely desperation. Okay, he should not have hid the fact he was married from Jane. I'm not saying that he should have, but I feel for him. I try to imagine what it would be like married to someone who's physically violent and is trying to murder me for 15 years. Would people feel differently about Rochester if he were a woman and the abuser was a man? Was Rochester's treatment of Bertha abusive? He hired someone to look after her. Sure, he didn't tell anyone about his wife, but as a reader, one has to be sensitive to the era the book was written in. The stigma of mental health in those days was a much different thing than it is today. Imagine being unable to share any sort of life or connection to anyone and having someone in your home who wanted you dead. That's no joke. And again, if one is sensitive to the era this book was written in, the fact that Rochester hired someone to take care of his wife and continued to care for her when she was violent and had tried to kill both himself and his brother-in-law casts him in a sympathetic light for me. The time this novel was written saw the expansion of asylums with terrible living conditions for their patients. And we witness in the book the terrible treatment of children in boarding schools. So only imagine how the treatment in those asylums were. Her being cared for at home was much more humane. Never mind that the treatment for her violence 100 years later would have been a lobotomy. Is Rochester a perfect gentleman? Heck no. But he also says when explaining the situation to Jane that the only thing to curb Bertha's vices was cruelty, and he could not be cruel to her, even though her presence in his life made him contemplate taking his own life, because he saw no way to ever find happiness. And that moment really shows the reality of how delicate someone's mental health is. The fact that he was dealing with abuse also, and that trying to care for someone in the end made him almost take his own life. And that's a real sentiment. All paths to happiness were closed to Rochester. I don't see him as the monster that some make him to be. He is also struggling with the complex yin and yang inside all men also. He sees in Jane his equal, and he wants and needs her companionship and presence in his lonely and hollow life. And usually to get what one wants, force can be used. And you see this moment when he is tempted to use physical force to make Jane stay, but he stops himself. He knows that to use force would be to change and kill this relationship that they do have. So he pivots and tries instead to convince her to stay by saying they will live abroad where they are not known and they can be to each other what they both wish to be. He wants Jane to be his wife. He wants to care for her and provide for her. But this approach minimizes Jane and what he loves about her, the male battle between being a provider but whose emotional needs are recognized. Rochester struggles displays the reality of many women of the time. Both struggle with their purpose in life, as well as what they would give up for love. I also really find Rochester and St. John Rivers really interesting character foils of one another. Rochester is reduced to an immoral life to try to fill his loneliness, and Jane never judges him for his sins. He is a hard man to like. He's an acquired taste. He's ugly, rude, and full of himself. But he loves Jane, and through his love for her, we see his better qualities come to the surface. He would do anything for Jane. St. John Rivers is the opposite of Rochester in every way. Rivers is a man of God. Rivers is immediately likable. He is good-looking, polite, and a servant of God. But as he discovers he wants Jane for his wife, to aid him in serving God, we see his worst qualities come to the surface. He is a cold and cruel man when he doesn't get what he wants. He is a man who will not bend from his singular goal. It's Jane that must bend to his ambitions. For just like Jane, Rivers was able to refuse love for his personal principles. Jane and Rivers have a lot in common. But Rivers has given up his freedom to be a servant of God, and that is something that Jane cannot allow herself to do. And the book ends with Jane thinking of St. John Rivers, and it seems to be a strange way to end the novel until I was writing this review. We must be reminded that this is not a romance novel. This is about a personal journey through moral, personal, and spiritual development. Jane, against a lot of readers' wishes, marries Rochester. But for her, that was the right choice. Rivers has no regrets in the life he chooses for himself. It was a life of service and a life of his own shaping. He regrets nothing as he sees death come for him. And I feel this is a reminder to the reader that death is coming for us all. And I hope that we too shall be able to look upon our lives as Jane and Rivers can, and see that we have not sacrificed our principles, whatever those may be. For as Jane says, I would always rather be happy than dignified. Now, there is some racism in this novel regarding Rochester and Bertha. Bertha is Creole, and there are some racist comments made about her which relate her mental illness to her race, which is gross. Charlotte often shows her European partiality by mentioning a few times when a European wind signaled different characters' destinies to them. And I find myself conflicted because there was so much to chew on in this novel. The writing is so good, and the story is deep. And here, if one is sensitive to the era this book was written in, one could also see that the sensitivity of the era it's being read in should be addressed by a reviewer. I really enjoyed so much of this book, but Charlotte Bronte's ignorance of race must also be mentioned. But I also find it odd that in so many places there is such respect for different languages and worldly knowledge. And it might be seen that these remarks are mostly made by Rochester, possibly signaling that his suffering is connected to his ignorance. Years ago, I read Wuthering Heights, and I disliked it so much it turned me off the Brontes altogether. But I'm glad I read Jane Eyre. It's probably going to be one of my favorite novels of the year. But have you read Jane Eyre? What did you think? Did you like it? Did you hate it? Could you not stand Rochester? Let me know in the comments down below. Please like and subscribe so that more people can discover some great books. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.